Alright everyone, now it's time for the big news of the day, which was Trump's Afghanistan speech, and depending on who you ask and what they consider important, they either really liked it or they really hated it. Some people were kind of in the middle. I would be kind of in the middle, because different components of his speech were either really, really good, or something that I deeply oppose. First, let's get to the bad part. The bad part is that Trump will be sending additional troops to Afghanistan. And I'll say this unequivocally, without any holding back. I oppose sending additional troops to Afghanistan. I oppose continuing to be really involved in Afghanistan. If we want to trade normally with and aid the Afghan government that's now our ally, so be it. You want to give them weapons or training, but having a bunch of U.S. troops running around actually in combat roles, we've been trying this for a very long time. We've tried it. We tried it with many tens of thousands of troops. We drew it down to a smaller number. We began conducting drone-based, primarily, warfare. None of these things actually worked. We did manage to restore order in Afghanistan originally with the high number of troops we had. My problem is the chances that adding a few thousand or so extra men to the fight in Afghanistan, the chances that that will actually solve the problem in a lasting sense is very low. The idea, I guess, is as long as we're involved there, we can maintain stability in areas the Afghan government controls. If we ever then leave, though, you have a problem. It becomes almost like the Korean situation. If we were to take all of the troops we've got on the DMZ out, there'd be a pretty good argument to be made that the DPRK would immediately invade South Korea. That's why they're there in the first place, as a protective measure. The idea is you don't want to suddenly massacre thousands of U.S. troops, because then the war will probably be declared. I guess the idea, my thought, my hunch, is that Trump is going to send specifically special forces into Afghanistan to conduct raids on Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and so forth, putting pressure, by the way, he alludes to this, on the Taliban by slaughtering them, basically. And forcing them to work with the Afghan government against these other groups, which would, at that point, it would probably bring lasting stability until some point in the future where they're no longer diplomatically able to agree with one another. It would be a lasting solution. I would say this: if his plan works, then he'll be applauded as almost heroic. I oppose it on principle and I oppose it on pragmatism. But being said, because I can't do anything about the fact that we're going to continue being involved there, which I find regrettable, at the very least, hopefully the strategy works. I just don't think that's likely. But there are other components of his speech that were very good. The first great thing was, hey, Pakistan is contributing to this problem. We're going to put weight on them to stop doing so. That's a good thing, because for a long time, Obama softballed the Pakistani government. Which does give shelter to these groups that operate on both sides of the border anyway. That's been a problem. It's one of the reasons that the Afghan government still can't maintain control of all of Afghanistan. If you want that to succeed, you do have to put pressure on Pakistan. The best thing he said was that that requires working with India more closely. I've said this for some time. We need to draw India solidly into the West. It's too large, has too much manpower, and is too economically important for us to continue sort of sidelining our relationship with them and relegating them to second-class status, especially considering where they are in the world. We've got to work with India. It helps with the question of Chinese power projection. It helps with putting pressure on Pakistan in regards to the Taliban and similar forces. It's just a great idea altogether. And if Trump wants to put pressure on China, by the way, in any way, shape, or form, you need India to do that. You have to have India's consent and cooperation in order to really do anything within that region. We've already got Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines all stacked up. We've got close ties with Thailand. It's obviously not enough. We need another major ally within the region. India is the #1 person you'd want to work with. And they've got Modi in charge, and Modi and Trump seem to actually get along. They seem to be somewhat similar. It's a great idea in every possible way to work more closely with India. They should be one of our top allies, at least within the Asian region. We can't keep focusing elsewhere in the world and ignoring India. It's a terrible idea. So that part I really agree with. The third part that was actually really good was the intro to the speech where he said, oh, well, our soldiers can't be going over and fighting and coming back to a country that's fighting itself. Now, some people, the hard-line Trump fans all interpreted this as an anti-free speech statement. They said, oh, he's talking about like Charlottesville and stuff. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about riotous behavior, violence in the streets. He's not talking about people saying things that are not quite PC. Do you think that Donald Trump, of all people, has a problem with you shitposting online? I don't think so. No, I don't think so in a million years. It helped him get elected in the first place because it was a mimetic campaign largely, at least in the latter half. No, he's not targeting speech. He's not saying, did Trump say, oh, I'm going to pass hate speech laws or something? No, he's not saying that. He's saying, oh, well, you know, people should avoid being violent to one another. He already called out both sides on Charlottesville. He was right to do that, by the way. He backs off slightly, but he never exonerated the alt-left. Not once has he given them any praise that, oh, yeah, it's just the fucking far-right Nazis that are a problem. Just ignore these communist groups over here. He never said that. He's not going to crack down on speech. He's going to try to Trump now, post-firing ban, and I predicted would move to the center, so-called. That means he's not going to be the 100% non-interventionist that a lot of people wanted him to be. And I said during the election he would be a mild reformer. Never once did he utter anything that would lead me to suspect he would be totally non-interventionist. In a perfect world, we don't have to police anything. In a perfect world, all of our troops are in the United States or in solidly allied countries where there's no actual fighting going on, and they're going over as part of some cultural exchange, so that some French forces come here and drink American beer, some of our forces go over there, drink wine, and they all have a good time. That's a perfect world. That's not the way the world works. During the election, I warned people, Trump is not going to mass deport 10 million people. Trump is not going to be a total non-interventionist. Trump is not, it was the far left. It was Trump's opponents that cast him off as wanting to do all these things. They're also the ones that say, oh, well, Trump is controlled by the Russians. He's not. Here's the secret. A lot of people on the right have taken up this line too. They think that Trump praises Putin all day and secretly really loves him or something. I don't have a problem with Russia. Putin, yeah, he assassinates his journalists and his opponents on a regular basis. He's a KGB dude. He's not nice. He's not a nice person. I don't have a problem with Russia, though, and that's probably the way Trump sees it. And he's alluded to this openly. And people still think he has some hard-on for the KGB, both his opponents and some of his so-called fans. I warned you that that was going to happen. I told you when Bannon was fired, look for a swing to the so-called center. Now, does this qualify as a war, what we're doing in Afghanistan? Yes and no. Again, I oppose it completely, but here's the reading of it. The Afghan government doesn't mind us being there, so at least we have their consent to operate in the state. The groups we are fighting are non-state actors that are not recognized as sovereign by any force in the world, not by countries we like, not by countries that we have difficult relationships with. The North Koreans don't consider the Taliban to be a legitimate governing force. The U.S., honestly, has bent over backwards to try to get them to participate in dialogue because there are other groups in the country that are so much worse, which is a little bit like the FSA situation. I opposed arming and funding them. If Trump got the bright idea in his head, oh, we should give arms to the Taliban, I'd say, oh, we're setting up for the next big terrorist attack here, because that's what happened in the 80s, and then those same people became, you know, those same mujahideen became Al-Qaeda, and so that would be a problem. Working with the government of Afghanistan is fine. My preference, though, is that we don't have troops on the ground in Afghanistan. It is a war still, yes. In the general sense, there's fighting going on, there's combat, so it's a war. It just happens not to be against a state actor. I have no problem with the U.S. conducting targeted strikes on, like, ISIS forces around the world, so long as we're working with the government. Insofar as we're doing that, I don't care if we operate in Afghanistan. The problem is this. Here's my problem. The drone program, which is preferentially used for such things, has a very high proportion of civilian casualties. It is my belief, based on no specific evidence, my hunch, that that creates more militants than it destroys. Because then you have a bunch of dead children, you have a bunch of dead civilians, and their relatives become radicalized. They become easy fodder for these other groups. And one can't fully blame them for being radicalized when they see a bomb get dropped on the local hospital. Oh, well, mom's dead and grandma's dead, you know, my brothers and sisters are dead. What am I doing with my life, basically? It's forfeit. It doesn't matter if I die because everyone I care about's already dead. You've destroyed the social fabric of that country. But Trump's speech, number one, was very well delivered, especially the first half. It will get the normies to back off of him, I think. That's really what he was trying to accomplish. I don't know that Trump even himself believes that adding a few extra thousand men to Afghanistan is going to solve the problem. The only other positive thing here is that he's pledging to back off, not micromanage, and let the generals handle it. And that will bring at least somewhat better results. Sort of his strategy in Iraq. It is working. In a shorter span of time, Trump has managed to force these groups out of areas as wide as Bush did, with a full ground invasion. With far fewer forces working with the local governments, Trump has, because of his rather hands-off military policy, managed to make it work. Iraq, compared to the Obama era and the latter-day Bush era, Iraq is now a success story. That doesn't mean it's successful, but comparatively it's better than it was before. Obama's strategy was everything should be bureaucratic, everything should be micromanaged, everything should also be oddly secretive to our domestic population while being very transparent to our enemies. And it doesn't work. He backed off too early, that is true. I always opposed invading Iraq and Afghanistan in the first place. Once we were there, though, it was our job to have an actual objective and fulfill it. Bush never made a solid objective. The objective in Iraq kept creeping around constantly. First it was, well, we're liberating it from an evil dictator. Then we're punishing these insurgent groups for being involved in 9/11, which they weren't. Then it was their chemical and biological weapons. We got to requisition them. Then it was we have to hunt down Saddam. Then it was we have to nation build. And it didn't work. And then Obama said, well, people are anti-war now. I think I'll just leave totally. Now, what you should have done is stayed in just long enough to achieve an actual stability that would be resistant against other elements that came in, yes, because we invaded. But then once we invaded, isn't it our responsibility, I would assume, to make sure that the people that we've screwed over don't keep getting screwed over? We've managed to consolidate the Afghan government to an extent where it's unlikely to completely fail against these militant forces. Sending in a few extra troops is not going to change the situation in any fundamental sense. You may be able to overrun a few more towns. You may be able to put more weight on the Taliban to, you know, back off and fight other militants. Will it work, though? No, but everything peripheral to that central mission was good about Trump's speech. It was a healing and togetherness speech. That's rather important, not just for his career position. Putting pressure on Pakistan, very good. Ingratiating ourselves to India, even better. Everything else about his proposal is really good. Even the back off of the military policy is really good, because it'll strengthen our capabilities without adding anything to the budget. Letting the generals and the field commanders do their job and not constantly breathing down their necks is the best thing that Trump could have suggested. That being said, are we going to accomplish anything, or in 2 or 3 years, are those thousands of extra men still going to be there? The Afghan government still won't be stable. I think that's the end result. But here's another secret. It doesn't really matter in terms of Trump's approval because it's a silent war. If you don't have mass ground invasion, a lot of people in our culture, unfortunately I would say, have come to the conclusion that as long as it's only a few thousand men and a couple dozen drone strikes, it doesn't count as an actual war. It's just combat against insurgents. I disagree totally. That's the conclusion they've reached, though. And so for anyone in the center, left, or right, they probably won't be fixated on Afghanistan. They'll forget all about this speech. The only thing they got out of it is, hey, we're going to pressure a state using a new ally, and people need to have togetherness. That's what they'll read into it. For them, it'll be positive. This will cause Trump's approval probably to rise substantially, because he's making that swing that I predicted he would make. He won't mass deport people. He's not some Nazi. He's not way out there on the non-interventionist fringe. Honestly, on that token, I wish that I had been wrong and that Trump's core fans, the Bannon lovers, had been right, because I think it would have been better for the world if we had gone down that route, but it's not where we're going. That means the war in Afghanistan will certainly exceed a 20-year war down the line. It will happen. We have to be aware of that fact. I oppose it. That alone doesn't make me want to suddenly side with Trump's false dichotomy opponents, like the Democrats. I mean, would they have done any different? No. Hillary Clinton would have done the same thing, except she would micromanage it, which means she'd get shittier results. So it could work. I'm not optimistic about the fact that it might work. And I'm morally opposed to war everywhere except for in the Korean Peninsula. Everywhere else, including Afghanistan, I think we need to get out of. If we're not welcome there, then our maximum involvement should be propping up an actual state entity that is already partially stable. Insofar as we're doing that in Afghanistan, no problem. You want to help them coordinate their campaigns? Okay. You want to give them aid? Okay, that's fine, because they're now an ally of ours. As far as putting additional ground troops in, I oppose it. So yeah, I oppose Trump on that measure. Everything else I have no problem with. And I strongly support his statement on India and Pakistan. That's the big takeaway line of the whole speech, though. A few thousand extra troops is a drop in the bucket of our total military forces. He's talking about a total change in our strategy within the region. That helps with more than Afghanistan. So for that, I would say, yeah, it's a great idea. Pakistan does shelter these groups. It's the biggest repository of the militants within the region. Well, there's, on one side, it's all about India. We can put pressure on them. They share a huge land border, making it clear, hey, we're siding with the Indians in this struggle, and we might side with them on your border dispute, too, if you don't pull your weight, Pakistan. That's an easy way to make them back off of their support for the Osama types, I think. It could indeed work. It probably will. On that token, he'll probably be successful. That alone will help the situation at least somewhat. That's about all. Peace out.